The Trent Affair during the American Civil War brought Britain and the USA to the very brink of conflict. It was only the intervention by Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, that helped pull the two nations back from the abyss. So, what actually happened in the Trent Affair in 1861? How close did the USA and Great Britain really come to fighting each other? And exactly how did Prince Albert help avert that war? The American Civil War between the Union in the north and the Confederacy in the south broke out in early 1861. From the outset, the British and French had tried to walk a tightrope of neutrality, although some would say they were also keeping their options open. The British had issued a declaration of neutrality, which declared both their intention not to get involved, but at the same time recognising the Confederates as a belligerent rather than area in an internal revolt. And consequently, Confederate ships would enjoy the same privileges as Union ships when visiting British ports around the world. In Washington, this rang alarm bells that Britain were really supporting the southern states. And there was some sympathy in Britain with the Confederates, not least based upon Britain's reliance on cotton for her textile industry. On a more strategic or imperialist level, some saw an opportunity to reverse the Oregon Treaty of the 1840s. In other words, extending British Columbia in Western Canada southwards into modern-day Washington and Oregon states. And others saw the breakup of the USA as beneficial to maintaining Britain's position in the world. But at the same time, the issue of slavery had galvanised many in Britain. Remember that Britain had outlawed slave ownership in her empire nearly a quarter of a century before, and Britain still had a large section of her population who were inspired by the reforming Christian evangelical zeal that had driven that movement. Their sympathies, then, were with the North. Despite the Union's concerns that Britain were on the verge of supporting the Confederates, or maybe even joining them, the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, had an opposite concern. He was disappointed that Britain hadn't gone further. Despite treating his breakaway states as belligerents, there had been no formal diplomatic recognition, let alone military support, from either Britain or France. On the back of his army's military successes at the First Battle of Bull Run, he decided to send two envoys to Europe on a charm offensive in October 1861. The two men he chose to press the Confederate cause were John Slidell from Louisiana and John Mason from Virginia. The plan was for them to break out of the Union naval blockade on the southern states and sail across the Atlantic, with Mason destined for London and Slidell for Paris. The news of this diplomatic initiative was probably the worst kept secret in North America, and the Union were desperate to prevent the mission. Their blockade intensified, but in the early hours of the 12th of October, the envoys slipped out of Charleston aboard a steamer named the Theodora. Union intelligence sources quickly informed Washington DC that the envoys were on their way, although they wrongly believed the men were on another Confederate ship, the Nashville, en route to Southampton. USS James Adger, captained by Commander John Marchand, was dispatched across the Atlantic to intercept them before they reached England. The US warship arrived at Southampton in England in early November, where Commander Marchand made no secret as to why he was so far from home. He announced that he would capture the two Confederate envoys within the sight of the British coast if necessary. But would the British let that happen? Strangely enough, no. A Royal Navy frigate was moved to Southampton to ensure that any such action happened outside British territorial waters, and thus avoiding a diplomatic incident with potentially disastrous repercussions. That diplomatic incident was avoided, but not because of the presence of that Royal Navy frigate, but because when the Nashville finally arrived in British waters, it transpired the envoys were not on board. And now an even worse spectre appeared. It seemed that the envoys were still coming, but not on a Confederate vessel, but on a British mail ship. The concerned British government sought legal advice. Could a US warship intercept a neutral British boat and remove the Confederate envoys? The legal beagles reported that the US warship could board, examine papers, and even take the British ship to a US port for adjudication by a prize court. But the US had no right to remove anyone, even Confederates, from a neutral ship and then allow that ship to continue on its journey without them. In other words, it was the whole ship or nothing. With that ruling, the British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, summoned the US Ambassador, Charles Francis Adams, to a meeting. The son of US President John Quincy Adams and the grandson of the second President, John Adams, was informed in no uncertain terms that Britain would take offence if such an event was to occur. It was the 12th of November, 1861. Little did either man know that just such an event had occurred. 4 days previously, the slide towards war had already started, far away in the seas off Cuba. Instead of crossing the Atlantic, the Theodora had sailed south to the Bahamas, where the Envoys intended to board a connecting voyage to Europe. Unfortunately for Mason and Slidell, they arrived at the British colony only to find that they'd missed their connection. However, the captain of the Theodora heard there were some British steamers moored at Cuba, but by the time they reached the Spanish island, those vessels too had departed. They now decided to wait for the next available steamer, RMS Trent, a British mail steamship. Built in the early 1840s on the River Thames and capable of carrying 60 passengers, the Trent was owned by the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. But as they kicked their heels, the Envoy's presence in Cuba came to the attention of the captain of a Union warship that was searching for Confederate blockade busters and privateers in the vicinity. Captain Charles Wilkes was commanding the frigate USS San Jacinto. Launched in 1850 at the New York Navy Yard, the Jacinto had served in the Far East during the Second Opium War, where, whilst protecting American interests, she'd actually fired on Chinese forts in the Pearl River. In 1859, the San Jacinto was part of the Africa Squadron, capturing a slaver and releasing over 600 slaves in Liberia. The 63-year-old Wilkes had entered the US Navy in 1818 as a midshipman. He now sailed to intercept the Envoys as they tried to board the British mail ship in Havana. However, when he arrived in the Cuban capital, he found that the Trent had departed the previous day. Undeterred, he now gave chase. At around midday on the 8th of November 1861, Wilkes spotted RMS Trent flying the Union flag. Approaching, he now fired 2 shots over her bow, and the British ship heaved to. A boarding party commanded by Lieutenant Fairfax and consisting of nearly 24 heavily armed sailors and marines was sent across. Upon boarding the Trent, Lieutenant Fairfax demanded a list of passengers, which was refused. He then announced that he had orders to arrest Messrs. Mason, Slidell and their 2 secretaries, and he was aware that they were on the Trent. At which point, Slidell stepped forward and told him that the men he was searching for were right in front of him. The captain of the Trent protested that taking the men, who were under the protection of the British flag, was against international maritime law. But with the San Jacinto lying only 200 yards away with her gun ports open, there was little he could do. The 4 Confederates were removed from the British steamer. A week later, the San Jacinto arrived at Hampton Roads, Virginia, and Wilkes informed Washington of his prize. A return message ordered him now to sail to Boston, where the 4 Confederates were imprisoned at Fort Warren. The elated Union newspapers heralded the triumph to their readers. Politicians were quick to join the chorus of congratulations being showered upon Captain Wilkes. There was even talk in Congress of producing a special medal for him. Heady stuff. But how would the British react? The news finally arrived on the other side of the Atlantic on the 27th of November and provoked an entirely different reaction. There, the press railed against the Americans for boarding a British ship and flagrantly violating maritime law. Just as in America, politicians were quick to jump on board, demanding action, if necessary war, to restore Britain's honour. The London Standard even went so far as to suggest the Union government were deliberately trying to provoke a war, maybe as a way of reuniting all the states against a common old enemy. The mood on both sides of the Atlantic became more and more bellicose. William Howard Russell, the Times correspondent in Washington, who had found fame during the Crimean War, wrote that public feeling in America was all for a conflict. Meanwhile, the British ambassador in Washington, Lord Lyons, sent a message to London urging a show of force, including moving additional troops to Canada. Prime Minister Palmerston met Ambassador Adams and expressed his concern that he thought there was a verbal agreement between them that just such an incident would not take place. What was going on? The truth, as far as Ambassador Adams was concerned, was, well, he hadn't got a clue. In an age when communication across the Atlantic was as fast as the swiftest ship, he was no wiser than the British Prime Minister. With Lord Lyon's bellicose urgings still somewhere out in the Atlantic, the British government were adopting their own response. And they didn't need Lord Lyon's to up the ante. After all, the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, was the man who'd coined the term gunboat diplomacy. On the 30th of November, one day after Palmerston had met Adams, his Foreign Secretary, Lord John Russell, sent Queen Victoria the draft of a memorandum intended for Lord Lyons to present to the US government in Washington, D.C. In strident language, it set out the illegality of the US warship's actions and demanded full reparation, the release of the passengers to continue their journey, and a suitable apology. And if such actions were not forthcoming within 7 days, Lord Lyons was instructed to close the British Embassy in Washington and return home. There was only one step further to go once diplomatic relations had been severed. Lord John Russell also advised Lord Lyons to inform the Americans that the Royal Navy's North America Squadron was being concentrated in Bermuda and Canada, facing the Union's eastern seaboard, and that troop reinforcements would soon be sent to Canada from Britain. One small incident was threatening to run out of control, and you only have to see how swiftly events unfolded in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand to see how seemingly inconsequential incidents can escalate horribly. How could a war between the USA and the British Empire be averted? It was now that Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, the Prince Consort, played a crucial and little-known role in history. The 42-year-old German from the Principality of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha had married the British monarch in 1840. Now is not the time to explore his life in detail, although maybe I will cover his story in another episode. If you're interested in that, then please type yes in the comments. By the time of the Trent Affair, Albert was dying from typhoid. On Saturday the 30th of November, the very day his wife received that draft memorandum, the Prince Consort's condition took a turn for the worse. He'd hardly slept the previous night and complained of feeling cold and of pains in his stomach. But even in this grave health, Prince Albert still had the energy to worry about that draft memorandum that his wife the Queen had received from the Foreign Secretary. He realised the disastrous consequences which must follow from sending the dispatch in their current bellicose, uncompromising form. What he really wanted was to find a way for President Lincoln to row back without losing face. And then he spotted it. On the 29th of November, the same day as the draft memorandum, Prime Minister Palmerston, in a separate letter, had informed the Queen that Mrs. Slidell and her daughter had now arrived in London. He went on to say that the wife of the Confederate envoy stated that the officer who had boarded the Trent, that's Lieutenant Fairfax, had said they were seizing her husband on their own initiative and not directly on the orders of Washington. On the other hand, Palmerston had also received reports from reliable sources that General Winfield Scott of the Union Army, who was in Paris, had claimed that the incident had been deliberately planned by his government to provoke a war with Britain. In such a war, General had gone on, his mission in Paris was to convince the French government to join the Union against Britain, with the prize being a restoration of Canada to France. If that was his plan, he was to be sadly disappointed, because just one day before this correspondence between Palmerston and the Queen, November the 28th, French Emperor Napoleon III had stated his backing for Britain. As Palmerston wryly observed, the government in Paris were probably thinking more about cotton than about Canada. Nevertheless, it showed the strain and heightened, almost feverish tensions on both sides of the Atlantic. It really wouldn't take much for either nation to be nudged over the edge. However, Prince Albert was convinced that the Union did not want to open a war on a second front against the world superpower of the day, and he had spotted something in Mrs. Slidell's statement that could potentially defuse the situation. On Sunday the 1st of December, although desperately ill, he forced himself to his desk at 7 a.m. and then slowly, painfully, drafted a memorandum for the Queen to copy, in which she would suggest alterations to her Prime Minister to his dispatch to the British ambassador in Washington. By the time he finished, the exhausted Albert could hardly hold his pen. His suggested amendment read, "The Queen cannot help feeling that the main draft, that for communication to the American government, is somewhat meagre. She would like to have seen the expression of a hope that the American captain did not act under instructions, or if he did, that he misapprehended them. that the United States government must be fully aware that the British government would not allow its flag to be insulted and the security of her mail communications to be placed in jeopardy. And Her Majesty's government are unwilling to believe that the United States government intended, wantonly, to put an insult upon this country and add to the many distressing complications by forcing a question of dispute upon us, and that we are therefore glad to believe that upon full consideration of the circumstances and of undoubted breach of international law, they would spontaneously offer such redress as alone can satisfy this country, v. the restoration of the unfortunate passengers with a suitable apology. In the margin of Albert's memo, the Queen was to write, "This was the last the beloved Prince ever wrote." Prince Albert's amendment, now penned by the Queen, met with the unanimous approval of her cabinet. It was incorporated into the official letter to the US Secretary of State, William Seward. Russell also sent a private note to the ambassador, instructing him to unofficially inform the Secretary of State of the contents of the letter before it was formally delivered, including the threat to close the embassy and what that might lead to. The letter left Britain later that day, the 1st of December, reaching Washington on the 18th. As intended by the ailing Albert, Presidents Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward saw the toned-down diplomatic letter as an opportunity to avert war without losing face. Strangely enough, they admitted that Captain Wilkes had acted on his own authority and apologised for his over-enthusiasm, and the two envoys were quietly released on New Year's Day, 1862. They continued their journey to Europe, where they achieved nothing. Both Britain and France remained neutral throughout the rest of the American Civil War. But in 1861 there was a moment where Britain and the USA could have ended up in a war that neither side had planned for, but the Trent Affair and the bellicose stances being adopted on both sides of the Atlantic could have slid towards a sort of Cuban Missile Crisis 100 years early. And the fact that it was avoided owes a large part to the dying Prince Albert. The importance of his amendment to the British government's response to the Trent Affair cannot be exaggerated. Dying from typhoid, he penned a letter that allowed President Lincoln to back down without losing face. It was a smart move from the Prince Consort. Just 2 weeks after his intervention, the last time he ever put pen to paper, he died at Windsor Castle on the 14th of December, 1861. Nowadays he's remembered as the long-lamented dead husband of Queen Victoria, as well as remembered in the Royal Albert Hall, the Albert Memorial in London, and possibly the Great Exhibition. But maybe his greatest legacy, completed less than 2 weeks before his death, was playing a crucial role in preventing a war between the UK and the USA. And despite a few hiccups along the way, they have never been that close to fighting each other since. Plenty more stories coming your way, but in the meantime, why not check out another one of my episodes? Or show your support for the show by becoming a patron or a member. There's a member button below and links to both in the description. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.